According to data from the Bank of Greece, deposit withdrawals from Greek lenders accelerated last month, in April that is. Deposits from households and businesses have fallen by more than €100 billion from a 2009 peak. That chart is not pretty. Let's bring back in Stephen Saywell, Global Head of FX Strategy at BNP Paribas, and Ramin Nakisa, Global Asset Allocation Strategist at UBS. Ramin, that chart of bank deposits, at what point does that become critical?
I think the scary thing that's happening at the moment is the ELA wasn't extended last week by the ECB. Now, that's effectively what's keeping the Greek bank solvent. So I think that is a concern. Now, obviously, that's a nuclear option for the ECB. If they want to force the Greeks to the table, they can always say, we'll change the collateral rules or we'll just stop the ELA altogether. So that's a worrying sign.
Steve, a worrying sign perhaps is the lack of compromise. Over the weekend, I'm sure many politicians expected Prime Minister Tsipras to come out over the next couple of weeks and give up some things, dropped a few of those red lines, and then you see that piece. Why Le Monde, I guess, is a bigger question.
hard to comment on that, why he chose Le Monde. I think the point I would make here is to look at the schedule of payments due from Greece over the next few months. The amount due in June is actually relatively small. It's July when you get the really big payments needed. So we're still in that sort of soft deadline moment. And I would argue, too, while this is the first IMF payment that's due at the end of this week, there's a chance they could be lumped together at the end of this month. So I would say this Friday is not going to be that critical. It's more really what happens by the end of June, and particularly as we go into July. So we would suggest a deal needs to be done by then to prevent a default.
Ramin, Steve says a deal needs to be done around the middle of July, but we keep being told that a deal is close. Now, I gave the Greeks the benefit of the doubt with this close line and assumed that it's some kind of strategy. And when I asked this question, I've had two responses. One is that it's an easy way of putting blame on the other side and put pressure on them. And two, it's trying to convince depositors that things are OK and we're about to get a deal. Doesn't seem that line, that strategy has worked at all. What do they do next?
I think the point at which they will have to give in to the demands of the institutions is July and August. I mean, this is why I chose my put expiry for June, because the big wall of debt redemptions is in July and August. And look at the creditors as well, because the creditors, if they default with the IMF, it's not so bad, because it doesn't necessarily lead to an effective default. But if they default on the ECB bonds, that would be a default. So I think, these two large ECB bonds, over $3 billion in July and August, those will be the crunch points. And if you look at the short-term debt, effectively for those 2 months, you've got about $7 billion in repayments in total. So I think that'll be the point at which they have to either capitulate or default. Those are the two options.
Your strategy is short-term pessimism, long-term optimism, and you've expressed that via options. That put expires pretty much the day that they're due to pay the IMF the whole whack. What if they don't? Do you change your strategy?
That's always a possibility. So that's what we're watching now. We're watching what's going to happen with the negotiations. Which path are they going to take? Are they going down the default route, which could be disruptive for a long period of time? Or are they going down the capitulation route, which probably leads to a collapse of the Syriza party and probably is a better outcome for markets, we think. Those are the two key paths I think you have to watch.
Steve, your world, the world of FX. I find it fascinating, the amount of people that say this doesn't matter to markets, and then we get these rallies, as you say, every time there's optimism of a deal. Then you don't really get the reversal. How do you play the euro in this kind of environment?
We think the right trade is to be short euro, and particularly against the dollar. And the key driver of this is the QE coming from the ECB. This is what's keeping the euro weak. Euro-dollar currently is driven much more by US data, I think, than anything coming out of Europe. And the reason for that is the market has a view that Greece may go down to the line, but there will be a deal at the end of it. And I think that's the key point here. There is, however, getting back to what we spoke about earlier, a relationship with the Swiss franc. There is a strong link with Greek government bond yields and the Swiss franc. So that's, we would say, in FX, the best way to play concern about Greece.
Ramin, just to pick up on the Swiss franc, of course, you're with UBS, so you have to follow this kind of thing closely. There's a meeting later this month of the SNB. They're going to have to move again?
Well, obviously, they lost credibility with what happened previously. So I think people take their guidance with a pinch of salt. I think that's, so whatever the meeting, whatever the outcome of the meeting is going to be, I think people will not take them seriously this time around.
Just to pick that up, Steve, has the Swiss franc become a one-way trade? See, we thought that, and then it wasn't. Yeah. And now people sit here taking the other view, and all of a sudden it's a one-way trade and the SNB is somewhat irrelevant.
Well, we're quite bearish, the Swiss franc, both against the euro and the dollar, particularly against the dollar. The reason for that is we think the Swiss National Bank has changed its strategy from one of that hard floor at 120 on euro Swiss towards very, very easy monetary policy. And if you look at short-term rates now, Swiss are by far the lowest in the G10. So for clients who are brave, the Swiss franc is actually the best funding currency at the moment. But what it needs is ongoing commitment from the Swiss National Bank to keep monetary policy super, super easy.
What is that ongoing commitment with a rate negative 0.75%? What more can they do?
Well, I think the key point here is comparison with the Eurozone. And remember, when they ended the floor in January, it was ahead of pending QE from the ECB. So the key point here is they have to keep Swiss rates significantly lower than those in Japan or in the Eurozone, which are the other QE countries. And that comparison is really going to determine, I think, how weak the Swiss franc gets.
You share this view, Ramin?
Yes, I think that's certainly true. I think the Swissy is still seen as a safe haven. I think there will be flows into the Swissy if we do see Greece, the situation in Greece worsen. And I think that's the last thing the SNB wants. So I think, zero negative deposit rates is the way to do it.
Ramin, Nakisa, Steve Saywell, great to have you with us this morning.